In early 2001, the Progressive Conservative Government of Ontario, Canada, introduced asset forfeiture legislation, a bill, which would, if passed, and it was passed, allow the government essentially to take a person's property without first having convicted them of any crime or wrongdoing. The idea was that if the property is likely in the future to be used in a crime, then you can seize it, whether or not you've even laid a charge against the person who owns the property. Now, the point of this video is not so much to discuss that law. Rather, with the Supreme Court of Canada having just upheld the law, I decided to look back to a television show on which I had appeared in 2001. This was before I was leader of Freedom Party of Ontario. I was a spokesperson at the time for Freedom Party of Ontario. Now, at the time, in 2001, I was relatively new to freedom in general. I'd spent a couple of years by that time advocating individual choice, individual freedom in Ontario, but I wasn't all that philosophically trained at the time. I think at around this time I was just starting to get involved in reading The Virtue of Selfishness by Ayn Rand. So here I am 8 years later, and I've become quite familiar with the writings of Ayn Rand and a number of other philosophers, because I discovered it was essential to know a lot more about philosophy in order properly to defend freedom, to advocate freedom. So in reviewing my television appearance in 2001 on the Rhonda London show, where I discussed this bill, I discovered a number of statements that I had made. I remembered a number of statements that I had made that today I would find counterproductive, wrong. I decided to go through that television appearance and pick it apart, tell you what I said that was wrong, how it was counterproductive, how it was wrong, and to say what it is I should have said at the time that would have been a better response. I'm hoping that as a result of watching this video, you, if you are an advocate of freedom, will not make the same mistakes I've made in the past. If you're not an advocate of freedom, you may nonetheless find this video interesting, because some of the ideas that you may currently hold concerning individual freedom you may discover to be wrong, counterproductive, etc., just in terms of understanding them for yourself. If there's any doubt about your position on freedom, if you ever think, well, maybe I'm wrong because I can't quite explain why I think individual freedom is right, perhaps this video will help you to identify why it is right and to alleviate any doubts you may have. So without further ado, let's go ahead to pick apart the argument that I made on the show.
Welcome back to Rhonda London Live. Joining our conversation, lawyer Paul McKeever. He's a spokesperson for the Freedom Party of Ontario. Paul, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Rhonda. You know, it's one thing to say that we need to protect people's property and their person, and frankly, Freedom Party and myself personally are 100% behind that. We think that's the appropriate role for government. In fact, the only appropriate role for government. Now, that description of the role of government might seem fine at first, you know, protecting person and property. And surely that is something that government must do, but that's not all government must do. That was incorrect for me to say that. The purpose of individual freedom is to ensure that you can live a rational life, that you can pursue values, things that really are objectively values to your life, so that you can pursue your own happiness, and so that you can do so in a rational way. The essence of a free society is that all relations between individuals are consensual. Some purported advocates of freedom say that all that needs to be done to have a free society is to prevent the initiation of coercive physical force. And therefore, you know, we have a definition like the one I provided in 2001, which says that the role of government, the only role of government, is to protect your person and property. The initiation of coercive physical force is one way to obviate the need for another person's consent, but it's not the only way. For example, stealing a person's property without them knowing about it doesn't involve the initiation of coercive physical force against the person, but it does involve obviating the need for their consent. You've obviated the need for their consent by taking it without their knowledge. So they haven't had the opportunity to apply their own rational process of thought to decide whether or not to give the value to you. The thief takes values without obtaining consent. That's what's wrong. The initiation of coercive physical force is not the only way to obviate consent. For example, let's say that I am a vendor in a variety store, and I take a can of poison and I relabel it. I put on there Coca-Cola or soup or something like that. Now, in that context, it's not irrational for you to assume that that can is indeed a can of Coca-Cola or a can of soup or what have you. And so if you bring that can up to my teller's desk and you pay for that can, I have just obtained value from you, but I have not given you value in return. I've given you poison in return. And I've gotten that value from you, that money from you, without your consent. Why? Because you thought you were purchasing one thing, and in fact, you were purchasing something else. You thought you were getting a value for a value, and in fact, you were getting a disvalue for a value. Now, that's called fraud. It might ultimately be called murder, depending on what happens as a result of your purchase of that so-called soup or so-called Coca-Cola that is actually poison. I've just given you an example where no physical force is involved. So if we talked about government doing nothing other than preventing the initiation of physical force, then the government would have no role in preventing fraud. So clearly it's something other than the initiation of coercive physical force that's involved. The essential is making sure that all transactions, making sure that all relations between individuals are consensual. The government has to ensure that in that situation where the soup or the Coca-Cola or whatever is being sold for money, traded for money, that in fact soup or Coca-Cola is in fact being traded, not poison. So that the person who's buying the Coke or buying the soup is not undermined in their effort rationally to pursue their own happiness by purchasing that soup or that Coca-Cola. What about defamation? Let's say that you come to me and you say, see Jack over there, his shoes will fall apart. If you buy shoes from him, they will fall apart within 6 months. He makes the crappiest shoes known to man. He says that they will last, a lifetime, but they really fall apart. He's very dishonest. Now, let's assume that that's absolutely false, that he in fact does make shoes that last a lifetime and that are great shoes. That vendor, that shoemaker, has just been defamed. And I now have the incorrect impression that that person who makes shoes is a disvalue, is not a value, that his character is not a value to me. This third party who's just lied to me is providing me with a false statement about the nature of reality, and they're doing that to undermine my ability rationally to decide whether to consent to a purchase of some shoes from a third party. That person is undermining consensual relations in society. And that is why the law steps in and says, no, that person shouldn't be lying to Paul McKeever about the shoemaker's character, about the shoemaker's shoes. That person, if he causes any harm, should have to pay up for the harm he caused by lying to Paul McKeever about the nature of that third party, about that shoemaker, and about that shoemaker's shoes. So there we have a situation where some third party has lied to me, misrepresented the facts of reality, and they've done it not so as to initiate coercive physical force, they've done it so as to undermine my rational process of thought, the one that is required for me to decide whether to provide my consent to a trade concerning shoes with this shoemaker. So we have to come up with a role of government that isn't limited to just protecting a person or their property from the initiation of coercive physical force. We have to come up with a definition that attacks the essential, that addresses the essential role of government. The essential role of government is to ensure that all relations between individuals are consensual, that the transfer of value from one person to another is never done without the consent of the person from whom the value is obtained, whether that value is spiritual or material. So I propose the following as a better definition of the role of government. The proper role of government, the only role of government, is to ensure consensual relations between individuals so that every individual maintains control over his own spiritual or material values, including his life, his liberty, and his property.
The proprietary rights of every individual, and those rights, rights to say, if you want to take this guy's property, you have to give him compensation at the same time, not later, but right away. Those rights evolved out of a morality that said that life is moral, and that we apply our reason to produce so that we can survive. We produce property to survive. And to take one's property is effectively to interfere with one's life, to interfere with one's attempts not only to survive but to thrive. So to take one's property without compensating him is in fact immoral. And this bill purports to be, a good tool for police, but it is in fact a step into or a step away from the respect we've always had for life and the pursuit of happiness, frankly, if you want to talk about it that way, but the right to live, to thrive, and to survive.
Well, what's wrong with what I've just said there? I've gotten part of it right. Property laws are founded on a morality that says that life is not so much that it's moral, but that life is one's own highest value. So I should have said one's own life is one's highest value. Not just that life is good. That's not personal enough. It doesn't direct whose life is good and to whom. And how much of a value is it? Well, it's one's highest value. And so the property rights are actually founded on a morality that says that one's own life is one's own highest value. That the pursuit of values, life-affirming values, values that are actually supportive of one's life, can only be done successfully. The pursuit can only be made successfully by means of rational decision-making and rational action. And that the purpose of one's own life is to pursue one's own happiness. That is the moral code underlying property rights and giving rise to property rights. So I could have been more precise about that. Secondly, however, and more important, I think, given the, between the two errors I'm talking about in this segment, the ethics I've just spoken of do not support the forfeiture law that I was talking about, but they also don't support the idea that the government can take your property so long as they give you compensation at the same time. No, if the government wants your property, they have to ask you whether or not you want to sell it. If you agree to sell it, you and the government have to come to an agreement as to the price. Only that would be just, because only that would involve consensual relations between the parties.
And when you look at the immorality of taking a person's property, their means of thriving and surviving, I think we're not just, we're not taking enough care when we say, well, we'll just add it to the toolbox. You don't just add to the toolbox something that so seriously interferes with, in some people's minds, God-given rights, but certainly rights that we all need to survive and to thrive.
All right, so what's wrong with that statement? At the time, I was not theistic. I'm not sure whether or not I was atheistic at that time. I was at least agnostic, I would think. So it was not the case at the time that I actually believed God to exist or believed rights to be God-given. So why would I say, in some people's mind, these rights are God-given? What does that contribute to my argument? Well, it contributes a disvalue. It undermines my argument. It also was a violation of my own integrity, and I'll tell you why. You're on a show there, and certainly that television station, CTS, has partially a religious mandate and partially a secular mandate. They have a mandate under our federal laws to do both kinds of programming. And of course you have to be aware that the audience that you're speaking to may be more religious than audiences on other stations. I was aware of it in 2001. Being a spokesperson for a political party, I had to be careful about what I say. I don't want to insult the viewership or the ownership of the station, and you want to get called back. So I think part of my rationale in saying that some people think these rights are God-given was to sort of tip the hat to those in the audience who think that rights are God-given. But I think that was a concession that was immoral on my part. I think it was something that was done in order to gain goodwill from people by suggesting falsely that I shared the view that rights are God-given, or that Freedom Party shared the view that rights are God-given. I don't. Freedom Party, the organization, does not, although some of its members have that view. That is not the official view of Freedom Party, and it is not my view, and it is not my view as leader of the party. At the time, I can't say that I was an atheist. I was probably an agnostic, so I probably wouldn't have felt all that strongly about the statement I was making. Today I do. Today I think my epistemology is more sound. Now, why was it inappropriate for me to concede that God, or to sanction the idea that God gives rights to individuals? Well, because the notion of God, saying that God exists, sanctioning the idea that God exists, is a violation of proper and sound epistemology and metaphysics. If you expect to have a free society, the laws of that society must be strictly rational. They must be founded on rational thought. For a claim to be made by government, for a law to be made by government that is rational, that means that the law is founded on physical evidence, that there is physical evidence for the claim upon which that law is founded. Rational laws in a free society, ought never to be founded upon arbitrary claims or false claims. So to suggest, as I have, or to concede as I have in that argument, in that segment, that some people believe that rights are God-given, I'm sanctioning, in effect, the existence of a being that pre-existed existence, which is impossible, and a violation of the axiom, existence exists. I've violated proper epistemology, the epistemology that is required if one is expecting to have a free society. The epistemology that says that nothing should be regarded as a possibility or as true in the absence of physical evidence. There is no physical evidence for God. God, the belief in God, is a matter not of evidence but of faith, almost by definition. And so by talking of God-given rights, I falsely suggested that things such as faith are a means of obtaining knowledge. I've also violated the ethics required of a free society when I say that, well, some people believe rights are God-given, and by doing so imply that that's a possibility. Because what I've suggested there is that if a God dictates something to be a right, or is alleged to dictate that something is a right, then it's a right, and that every person should have that right. But also, that if a God said it's not a right, then it's not a right. Now, there are any number of gods, alleged gods, that people pray to or have faith in around this planet. And there are all a number of abominable rules against and for, mandates and prohibitions set out by these alleged gods. If that is the basis upon which we determine right and wrong, then right and wrong obviously is going to have an impact on what rights you have in law and what is the nature of your society. If you're to have a free society, if you are to be free to pursue your own values in the only means available to man, which is by rational thought and action, you cannot afford to concede that ethics is something dictated by a supernatural entity. So it goes right down the line. To concede that rights are God-given is to violate metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and politics, all of which, and I'm talking about the epistemology and metaphysics and ethics and politics required of a free society. What should I have said instead? Well, it's not so much a question of what I should have said instead. It's a question of not saying what I did say. I should not have said that some people believe that rights are God-given. I should simply have stuck to the basics and the essentials and said that every person requires these rights of life, liberty, and property if they are to pursue their own happiness by rational means. That's it. I need not have made any concessions to anyone else, and by doing so, I actually undermined the case for freedom, because I conceded metaphysics that are inconsistent with freedom, epistemology that is inconsistent with freedom, ethics that are inconsistent with freedom, that would undermine freedom. If someone says, my God says that no woman should be free to have an abortion, or my God says that no person should be free to keep what he earns, that he must share the fruits of his labors with everyone equally, how do you expect to have property rights in that kind of society? You cannot afford to sanction, for any reason, the supernatural, the irrational, the altruistic. Never, never, never can you sanction that. And by doing that, I undermined my own argument. I made a case against freedom. I made a case against rational ethics and epistemology and metaphysics, and I completely blew it. Don't do what I did. Say nothing from which one could infer that you're allowing for the possibility that maybe existence doesn't exist, or maybe A isn't always A. That maybe faith is just as good a way to obtain knowledge as, the rational process of thought about that for which there is physical evidence. Don't sanction in any way, don't suggest there's any possibility that right and wrong might be best determined by what a supernatural being dictates. Maintain at all times that those rights are simply a fact that stem from man's nature, that are needed because of his nature, if he is to pursue his own purpose, which is to pursue his own happiness by rational means, to pursue those values which are consistent with his life, and thereby to achieve that happiness by rational means. That's all. Take care. And remember, if you want to advocate freedom well, advocate reason.